So after the Baroque period, right, we switch into the classical period. So I have this like written as like 1750 to 1830, approximately, right? Always like give or take. Those are never fixed dates. But if you see like here, right, like 1730 is probably a better estimate of where composers started like kind of playing with these ideas, and then they became more prevalent in the mid 1700s, right? But like kind of the reason for this, like again, music is always a reflection of the time where it was written. So the first thing is that like European like philosophy, like the cultural kind of values kind of shifted, right? And they started thinking more about like antique Greece, right? So this was kind of the idea that like music should be cleaner, right? Like music should be like clean is just a really good way to put it, right? We want things that are simple, we want things that are straightforward, we want things that are pretty. So those were kind of the important values that came out, right? So for example, like this sounds nice, right? Right? But it's not the cleanest. I wouldn't say that's like very straightforward music. If I asked you to, hey, like sing me back what you heard when I played that, right? Like it's not super obvious what you would sing back to me, right? So the music can get a little bit complicated. So then people didn't want complicated anymore. They said, give us music that is simple, that we understand, right? So and that's what there's more like a desire for like structure and clarity. And the other thing is that there's kind of a big economic shift as well. So in the Baroque period, right, like public music became really, really popular, really fast, but a really famous or a really good composer, right, would kind of have the financial support of their whole town. And what shifted in the classical period is that like like the nobility and like the royalty became like the main patrons of music or the main financial backers of music. So music was kind of like no longer about like music was more like catered to like their desires and their like performance needs, right? So this is when the idea of like having like the court musicians, right? Because many famous musicians had like stays with different like monarchs or different like dukes, right? Or different members of the nobility, right? For a period of time where they were artists in residence. So that's kind of when this trend started of being an artist of residence at like a monarch's like castle. So and then when you're a composer there, right, you have to like do your job, which is play for their audience. And a lot of times these courts would have like fixed musicians, right? So they would have like the same set of musicians and different composers like rotating through. So what happens there is that you have musicians with like a fixed level of ability, right? So you're not necessarily sure if you're getting like the best musicians, right? Or the musicians who can play the super complicated music if that's what you write. And it's actually something that Mozart wrote about once, right? And he talked about the idea of like the rehearsal and rehearsing his music, right? Because not all music is for the soloist. Music is a lot of times like for the group, right? And in his writings, like he seemed to imply that when you rehearse, you should like the music should be simple enough that you can rehearse together one time and then you should be able to play it, right? And they're just like kind of like emblematic, right, of the way that music was written. The goal was like writing for performance and writing so it's easy to perform and intuitive to perform. So if you have something like this fugue, right, and you have 4 different people singing it together, right, you know that you're going to have to practice a lot to get all of those voices to balance out, to all be at the exact same time, to all be at the exact same volume, to make sure nobody overpowers each other, right, to make sure you get all of the rhythms right. That would take a lot of practicing for 4 different people compared to like, so here's an example of a very simple Mozart sonata. Here's just like the first like 2 or 3 measures, right? Like, right? Like look at that. Like it's simple, it's pretty, right? It's approachable, right? If I was giving that to like my one main voice and like a couple of accompaniments, it's like so. Right? Maybe I have one person playing that and then right? It's pretty, it's easy. You see how it goes together. If I played you that and said, hey, sing me the tune that you hear, you'd probably be able to do it, right? So that's kind of like what the ideas behind classical music were, right? And the other thing is that what also became really popular during this time was opera. So remember, like, to make a living, right, composers have to write music that people want to listen to. And then composers have to compete with opera music. So like kind of imitating like those vocal lines of opera, right? Like the singing of opera with like a simple accompaniment was very, very popular. That was another like motivation behind making music cleaner and simpler and prettier. So here's some key characteristics of the classical period, right? And then we'll break it down and I'll play some simple Mozart kind of to like showcase this, right? But again, like a single melody with accompaniment. You're never gonna, like sometimes, so the ideas of the past are always influential. Like our classical builds on our Baroque, our Romantic builds on our classical, right? But, so counterpoint will show up like occasionally in classical music, but the main idea is a single melody that's simple with simple accompaniment. So, I'll play some examples later, right? But then compared to Baroque, right, our melodies are also like clearer and simpler, which I've said. But again, let's compare it. And I'm sure you're getting a little sick of hearing these, but we'll move on from them soon, I promise, right? But if you're comparing, right, our melody versus like one is more operatic, right? One is more like simple, right? And then, so more keys, like more melodies, more rhythms, dynamics. So despite all that I keep saying about like simple, like clean, simple, straightforward, right? Our like depth of like range, right? Like our volume changes, our like changes in key signature, right? Our changes in rhythm, all of those things did grow. And part of that is that instruments became like slightly more advanced. A lot of instruments were invented during this period too, right? But part of that too is like as time grew like forward, right? Music is now like less influenced by church, like the church. Baroque music was still very much tied to the idea of the church choir, right? Especially at the beginning. So as you get like more and more like separation between music and like the church, right? It's not, the composers still write things for the church, of course, but they're more separate. Like music isn't based on the church. So because of that, like kind of the amount of freedom that you're allowed to have in your music is still a little bit more, right? Like look at Bach. Like Bach's music, of course, is very expressive in its own ways, but it's not like overtly, dynamic. Bach isn't gonna like shout at you and then like whisper at you. Like it's not gonna change like that, right? The amount of Bach is very even in some ways, right? Like tonally, in terms of volume and in terms of like mood. And that wasn't really the case here. Now we'll see like different moods in the same piece, right? Which will become very clear in the Mozart I'm just about to play. So those things were kind of more allowed. And then the other thing that happened during this period is there's like set forms of music, right? Like sonata form will be like you have an introduction of a main theme, you have like a development on that theme, right? You have that theme repeat itself. You'll change the key signature of that theme. So, for example, you might like start here. Right, and then you might go something like that, right? So it'll change its key signature, but it'll be like the same melody. So things like that, like the form of music became very strict because like what I was talking about, right, when I was talking about structure, is there were a lot more rules, I guess. So if you publish something and you're like, all right, this is a sonata, right? People will look at your sonata and they'll say, does this follow all of the rules of a sonata? Because people like things that follow those kind of structural rules, right? And the other thing that, well, I can't really play you a whole symphony from my piano, of course, but that's just like important during this time, was the symphony was kind of created during this time or invented during this time, and that was mostly due to Haydn. So now to demonstrate some of these things, right, I'm going to talk you through Mozart, and this isn't necessarily, this is a little bit more unorthodox Mozart, like what I played you here, right? So let me play you a few lines of this, or just for fun, right? Where is it? Okay, here we go. right? But another famous thing from this time is where is it? Okay, here we are. So quintessential Mozart, right? Very like classic, like it's a little bit friendly, it's a little bit happy, right? It's not necessarily as like passionate, right? But one of the most important things about the classical period is that you were allowed more like feeling than that, right? You're allowed to be a little bit less neutral, right? So this is not a Mozart, this is part of the sonata in C minor, right? So this is a different Mozart sonata. So that was a C major sonata. Where are we playing from? Oh, here we go. Right. Right, first line alone. It's loud and then it's soft, right? Then here you're going to see like a melody with clear accompaniment, right? Right, and just ending early there, but that like exhibits a lot of our classical traits, right? Like think about here. Like where else does that come, right? Besides like the opera, you can think about it. You have like a female singer, and then you have like a male singer singing back to them, right? The answer. And it goes back. Right? Like the same way in an opera, two people would sing back and forth at each other, right? And think about what our left hand is doing for so much of this song, right? At the beginning of this page, you have... And your left hand is going... Right? It's simple. It's accompaniment. We know very clearly, right? Think about it, right? We know what's our melody and what's our accompaniment. Like, so let's go back to this line, right? Like, imagine if I played that, like Bach counterpoint, right? Everything the same. Think how unpleasant it sounds, like to a certain degree, right? Like you're not trying to hear, right? You want to hear. So that's kind of our idea of the melody with accompaniment, and that's Mozart's C minor sonata, just for reference. So that's just kind of some of the ways. So that's very like quintessential classical music, right? And then some of the composers from this time, of course, you have Mozart, you have Schubert, you have Clementi, Haydn, Salieri, right? So a lot of really good composers.